The ocean stands up before anyone believes it will. At first, it is only a new shape in the sound low, muscular, not quite like wind, not quite like rain. Then it lays its hand on the shoreline and the shore gives a little, like a person who does not want to start an argument. Along the Florida Gulf, along the mud flats of the Sundarbans, along the coral rim of the Marshalls, along the half-remembered quay in Beira, Mozambique, everything that lives by water listens. In a fluorescent-lit room in Miami, Leila Castillo drags a blue cursor along a forecast track and watches a thin red line rise over a pixelated map of a barrier island. She knows by the backs of her hands. She has been teaching this line for years. Storm surge, height above ground, where wind, low pressure, and shallows conspire. Tonight the line lifts like a breath taken in. The Gulf is hot, the shelf is wide, the moon will be fat and close. Her code hums, the old facts with new insistence. The right front quadrant, the funneling of bays, the way a shallow bottom lets water stack, the way a little subsidence adds up to a foot here, a foot there, a drowned living room, thousands of miles east, under a sky that cannot decide if it is silver or brown. Kamal Udin nods his boat to a mangrove root as thick as his thigh and glances at the embankment that keeps this part of Sotkira off maps of the Bay of Bengal. The polder is a man-made promise, earth-piled, grass-sown, a spine between salt and rice. It leans now under 2 monsoons worth of worry and a cyclone bulletin that says the word he hates slowly, like it tastes bad, severe. In the tea store where the radio lives, voices argue about kilometers and millibars, about what a meter above highest tide really means when the tide itself is a moon's mood. He doesn't sleep. You do not sleep when the river breathes different. On Majuro in the Marshall Islands, Mia Joran wipes salt from a window with the sleeve of her shirt and tests the water in a blue plastic drum with a tin cup. She tastes carefully, brackish. She says to herself, not unkindly. January was a king tide month and the runway flooded twice. March brought waves that leaped seawalls the height of her cousin's chest. The freshwater lens under the atoll, what the old men used to call the island's secreties, thinner this year. When a wave overwashes, it takes a day for the taste to return to almost sweet. Lately, it takes longer. She keeps the school's doors open until late because the classrooms are higher than most living rooms, and the children like the way the whiteboard makes sense even when the tides do not. Polo Reyes sits on a bench outside a barangay hall in eastern Samar, watching a typhoon cone swallow a map on his phone. He hates cones. Cones say two things at once. It could be you. It could be not you. 10 years ago, he watched a wall of water lift houses in Tacloban and lay them down like somebody else's problem. He tells his neighbors that storm surge is not a metaphor but a dome of water shoved ashore by wind and low pressure in the shape of the sea bottom. He draws with his hand in air. Here the shelf is shallow, here it gets deep fast. Here the bay narrows, and the water has nowhere to go but up. They nod. Some will listen. Some will stand at their windows until they can't. South again, where the Indian Ocean wraps coastlines like a long arm, a nurse named Teresa in Beira watches the sea push against the city's teeth. She remembers a different storm, a ring of wind named Idai that turned her hospital into an island. The city learned that month where water goes when it wants to, and how a river can be a lake for weeks if a surge meets a flood on a road made of bureaucratic promises. Tonight the sea does not scream yet. It murmurs like a patient trying not to wake a sleeping house. In the modeling room, Leela's phone buzzes with a message from a colleague at the National Hurricane Center. Likely overnight. Rapid intensification. The phrase engineers and meteorologists hold like a hot coin. The eye wall tightens, the pressure drops, the wind makes a funnel of itself, and the ocean obeys the new math. She zooms in on a slender causeway stitched across turquoise and imagines water lapping at the underside of rebar like a thief deciding whether to try the door. The model's tide clock glows bright. Peregrine spring tide 2 nights from now. The moon will be as close as it gets. The ocean will have help. In Sotkira, the loudspeakers start at dusk. They were tested last year on a spring day, and everyone laughed and covered their ears. Tonight the sound lands low in the gut. Move to shelters, bring dry powder, water, documents, secure livestock. A motorbike bangs along the top of the embankment. A boy hanging off the back with a flag that says volunteer, and a voice as steady as a straight wall. The cyclone shelters stand on concrete legs taller than men, their windows like gills. Kamal touches a beam with the 2 fingers his mother taught him for luck. He thinks of his wife's father, who believes in mangroves more than masonry and whispers to the trees when no one is looking. And he thinks of the year the embankment failed and the river remembered it could be a sea. On Majuro, the airport pumps run, coughing their mechanical cough. Mia calls the radio and reads the schedule for the king tide hour, the way they do now. Elders to the church hall, families on the windward road to the school, boats pulled by noon. She tells a story on the air, as she always does, because stories make instructions stick. Her grandmother laying a breadfruit leaf on the concrete to see if it moved under the moon, the leaf telling them how high to tie the pigs. On the barangay bench, Paolo draws up his list. Who has a truck? Who has keys to the school? Which generator actually runs? Who will call the mayor if the tower falls? He texts the man with a coffin shop 2 streets over because the man with the coffin shop keeps a chainsaw that starts every time. The first gust snaps a flag in half. He looks at the water and sees nothing yet because storm surge is a late visitor, a guest that arrives after the rain when you have put away the good plates and decided the worst is over. Papers shuffle in cooling offices in capitals far from salt. Budgets list levies measured in feet and walls measured in years. In a committee, someone says the words managed retreat, and someone else writes them down and looks out the window and sees buildings that will not move. In a port city named for a colonial governor, Teresa checks for bags and wonders, briefly and without drama, how high the second floor is above mean sea level. She laughs at herself for thinking like a map when she is a nurse, then stops laughing when a gust sends a new ripple across the ward's curtains. Night walks in across the water. Leela breathes once and hits publish on an internal memo that carries numbers with more edges than usual. Kamal ties the last knot and lifts his daughter up the cyclone shelter stairs, while pretending to admire the chalk drawing she refuses to stop making, because there is nothing else to do. Mia puts her hand to the concrete seawall and feels it cold and damp, a sleeping animal with a bad dream. Paulo hears the first distant metal scream of a sign leaving its pole and thinks of a wave he dreamed once, taller than the church. Somewhere far offshore, a pressure field deepens like a thought. Water gathers itself into a lentil-shaped mound and begins to move, and under a fat white moon that will rise closer tomorrow, the tide chart on Leela's screen ticks silently toward a line she knows too well. The wind snaps, the ocean pushes. The first shingles lift, the embankment sweats, the radio hesitates and returns. Every door that faces water remembers how it opens. The first doors go not with a crash but with a deep, private sighward swollen. Hinges humbled. Paulo grips the jam and feels the building inhale, rain needles sideways. He counts between gusts like a child taught to find lightning's distance, but the math breaks because the sound never leaves. He sends the first message he always sends. Now. Evacuate now, not later. Now because water waits for you only in children's books. On the Florida model, Leela's line kinks. She has run 1,000 hypothetical days where the eye tracks parallel to shore and then hooks in. This one hooks. The shelf off the barrier island is broad and inviting, a hand under a bowl. The hot loop current eddy offshore gives the storm calories like candy. A colleague texts, look at the southern bay. She glances there as the trap, a mouth that narrows, a bay that stacks water when the wind says it must. Her map paints red over neighborhoods with porches and paddleboards hanging under eaves. She sees the right front quadrant pulling water into a river mouth, the tide climbing a stair it did not build. Insert Kira, the embankment weeps through the weep holes, as designed, until the holes clog with grass and plastic and the kind of silt that arrives when mangroves are cut back for view and wood and drains are not cleared often enough because no budget ever loves maintenance. Volunteers run with bamboo poles. The boy with the flag has a whistle. Kamal wades thigh deep to move a drum of rice and laughs once because laughter keeps breath moving. And the old man who talks to trees looks at the river with the expression you say for times when cousins don't come home. The loudspeaker stutters, then recovers. Shelter, it says, in a voice that sounds like a human trying to be a machine. Mia watches a set of waves line up from the reef like soldiers who want to be forgiven in advance. The first series slaps the seawall and spills, nothing more than a complicated splash. The second is slower, with more muscle. It pours in a way that makes the schoolchildren clap because water is fun until it is work. She knows the time highest tide will come in 2 hours, and the long period swell from a storm that will never be in their paper still arriving across the Pacific will stand on the shoulders of the moon. She texts the principal, move the books. In Beira, Teresa stacks mattresses on cots with nurses whose sandals slap on concrete. The hospital windows are sandbagged because someone learned the lesson the old way. She checks the generator twice. Then again, doctor walks in with jeans soaked to the pocket and says the obvious sentence that will become a refrain. It is higher than last time. When you live on a coast, last time is a thing you carry like a scar. On the barangay street, a man who promised he would never leave stands in his doorway to prove his promise and takes a photograph of the street looking like a canal. He sends it to friends with a message, we will be fine. The water lifts a refrigerator in someone else's house 2 streets away and teaches it to float. The river that loves its banks forgets their names. In Miami, in offices with maps on every surface, a voice on a conference call says, we need to talk about the causeway, and 3 civil engineers say at the same time, we have talked about the causeway. It is a single road on concrete legs, a thin truss that carries groceries and ambulances and regrets. Layla says, the surge window aligns with the tide window, and the room, which has been practicing urgency all week, goes quiet. The Sundarbans answers the storm with the memory of mangroves, where the trees are close and old, waves kneel. Where the swamp was turned into ponds and fields, the water carries anger. Kamal's friend Saba, who built his house on a patch of higher ground because his grandfather swore by a certain termite mound and a certain bend in a creek, watches his fence tilt and says tie the goats to the stairs, not because it will help, but because it will keep his hands busy for 30 seconds that would otherwise be a hole. The wind turns. Paulo has been waiting for that. turn when on shore becomes something worse and the bay becomes a bottleneck. The radio on his desk crackles with a voice from the Coast Guard that sounds 3 rooms away. Surge in the channel. It says, 2 meters above normal already, and the words break into numbers on his pad that will be wrong a minute later because the ocean is not a spreadsheet. He throws a rope to his neighbor and pulls the door shut against a river designed to enter through walls. On Majuro, the children stop clapping. The third set of waves arrives not as game but as grievance. Water pours across road and sideways through yards and into the room with the charts of the world. On a map, the atoll is a thin bracelet. In life, it is skin and salt, and 2 palm trunks nailed together to make a bridge over a puddle that used to be the ocean. Mir sees a boy slipping and shouts his name and hates that she must raise her voice against the sea. A mile offshore in Florida, a buoy reports water levels that look like a mistake. They are not the tide gauge attached to a pier that tourists love to fish from bounces and then records a cresting number, a kind of note held too long. Wind pushes water. Low pressure lifts it. Shallow bottom stacks it. If you had a window into the air, you would see a dome of water under the cloud spiral, moving with an animal's assurance toward a shoreline that has grown since the last time we made a map because the cranes did not stop. In the low farm roads behind the coast, rain falling inland looks for a way out, meets a tide with no patience, and turns around without apology. It is called compound flooding in papers. In kitchens, it is called "we have never seen this." Gates Teresa says to nobody in particular, and her colleague grins because they have a joke that has kept them sane. When it rains too long, they say, "Open the gates." When the sea pushes, they say, "Close the gates." There are no gates. There is a door with a towel at the bottom and a hospital trying to be a fort, and the memory of a storm that once made an inland sea. Kamal lifts his daughter onto a table and loosens the knotty twine he can feel in the dark. Water enters the lower rooms of the shelter as it was meant to, the building designed to let it pass through, not hold it, because to hold the bay is arrogance. He can hear the men on the embankment shouting about a boil on the landward side, a small fountain where seepage decides to speak. The old man puts his hand against the earth as if it is a forehead and says nothing. Sometimes you do not talk to a fever. Leela's cursor hovers over the causeway. On the screen the road disappears under a blue that is not sky. She makes an error bar with her thumb and forefinger and knows, quietly, that it will not matter. She writes an email anyway. She calls a number marked sheriff and a number marked mayor and she says, without ornament, that the ocean is coming into the kitchen and it would be good to leave now. A refrigerator turns a corner on a street where refrigerators never float. A boat rides up the stairs of a cafe and becomes furniture. Somewhere a phone alarm wails and is stuffed into a pocket because the world is already one long alarm. Somewhere else, a line on a paper map, marked at the maximum surge reached in 1970, is overtaken by a wave that did not read. The tide clock on Leela's screen ticks to the hour. The moon, indifferent and exact, lifts the ocean's shoulder at the moment the wind decides to push hardest. On the embankment, the boil becomes a hole. Across the atoll, the school door takes a breath in and out and then lets go. In the barangay, Paulo hears a sound he dreaded and could not remember, the low, heavy freight of water when it travels not as waves but as a body. He looks at the church cross, at the mango tree behind it that survived the last decade by grace and geometry, and understands again the thing everyone on a coast has to learn over and over, that the sea is not against you, it is only for itself. The surge does not shout. It wraps itself around pilings and knees and the bases of trees and then rises crabwise across floors the way a spill learns shape. Paulo steps back as the door moves away from his hands in a way doors are not meant to. The room becomes a pond with furniture. A freezer drifts like a new animal. He grabs the rope he looped around the stairwell and passes it around 3 waists in a knot he learned from a man who tied boats for a living and then tried to tie his life after everything lifted. The water is warm and brined and filled with a smell of old leaves and diesel. In Sokira, the embankment lets go in a kind of exhausted confession. It starts small, a slump, a careful settling, the earth rethinking its loyalties. Then a section slumps into a channel and the bay enters like a cousin you love and do not trust. The cyclone shelter's legs hiss against the current. A goat bleats on a staircase and then stops. Kamal presses his daughter's head against his chest so her ear is filled with his heart instead of the storm. The old man who talks to trees sobs once and then is silent, because what else is there to say after the river remembers it was salt first? Across on Majuro, the ocean leaps the wall. It does not feel like a leap. It feels like a shrug. Water goes where the street goes because the street was laid along the only piece of coral wide enough for a long straight thing. And concrete does not float. Mia shouts above the wind, hustling children onto benches pushed into corners. Someone lifts a sewing machine onto a shelf like a photo of a family, a thing you want to keep memory from erasing. Salty water finds the school's electrical outlets. The lights flick, then do the polite thing and leave. In the dim, a girl points to the fish that darts between desks and says, "Look," and then covers her mouth because laughter is treason in a time like this. In Florida, the causeway becomes a rumor. A police cruiser parks before the low dip and flashes lights that mean 2 things. Do not come, we are here. Down on the Beira island, A home with an English name and a sprig of rosemary by the step lifts into parts and moves into a channel as if it always belonged. A man on a second-story balcony films while crying. The water in the garage lifts his truck and the truck kisses the ceiling. He says to no one that he will never buy another thing, and the promise is clean and impossible. Leela's surge model meets the tide gauge like a handshake negotiated without words. The highest line flattens and then smirks upward again when a gust curves a column of air into a shape that makes the sea willing. The hospital in Beira is an island, then a peninsula, then an island again. Teresa keeps the ward doors open because water surges, and's better served than trapped. A mother delivers a baby that cries like fate. A man whose leg wants stitches tries to stand and sits again. Outside, the street grows short and then disappears. The river remembers the road the colonizers built too low and takes it back. In buildings crafted without memory, generators cough and die. In buildings with remembered mistakes, they cough and live. Paulo feels the water nudge his knees, then his thighs. He has made 3 phone calls in the last 10 minutes. To the mayor, who says, copy. To the man with the chainsaw, who says, on my way, and laughs because to laugh is to keep the demons polite. To his son, who is inland with a grandmother and asks why the signal is bad, and he says, because the sea is talking louder than me. On Majoromir lays a towel under the door out of habit, then looks at her hands and laughs at herself not with joy but with the astonished affection we all hold for our own rituals in the face of physics. She leads a prayer without heavy vowels. Not for the water to stop, but for the children to think this is a story they once heard and not a thing they dream every time they hear rain. In the corner the atoll's freshwater lens slips another inch toward brine. You could calculate it. Gibbon Hertzberg tells you the relation, like an old uncle with a slide rule. She knows it by tongue and bucket. In Satkira, the surge reaches the pond where fish used to live before everyone needed shrimp money and salt. Water leaps the bank and does not bother to change its name. The mangroves, those patient engineers, hold a line that steel could not hold for a fraction of the cost and twice the poise. Where their roots are dense, the waves bow. Where the roots are stumps, the waves swagger. A woman who refused to leave because she wanted to check on a hen climbs stairs slick with algae and curses the hen for being sensible and finding higher ground before she did. On the Beira island, downstairs, living rooms become mouths. Salt water licks drywall and breathes into insulation and makes mold in a week that will take years to forget. A neighbor bangs on a door with a 2x4 because the people inside wedged it shut and forgot that water offends locks. The bang 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 is the oldest imperative. The door opens. They move upstairs, then onto a roof. A neighbor looks at a palm bent sideways and says, that palm has been here longer than I've been alive, as if the palm owes him an apology. And the palm keeps bending because it is smarter than all of us. In Beira, the old neighborhood flooded in 2019 remembers the taste of this sea. The new neighborhood says, we are high enough, and learns. A jetty that once kept a river mouth polite funnels the surge like a joke with no kindness. Teresa checks the babies, counts her nurses with her lips, lifts a bucket, ties a line. She does not think about policy or ministers. She thinks about a flooded storeroom where last year's boxes of gloves might still be. Paulo watches a chair pass a window like a swim. He ties a knot under the banister and lays his cheek against the wood to feel if the building still has a spine. He sees his mother's rosary on a nail and thinks of the night, a decade ago, when a wall of water cut through a city and the bodies were too many to count without breaking people who count for a living. He says out loud, for himself to hear, this is not that, and also, because he knows a lie when he says one, but it is cousin to it. In Miami, Leela does the thing she says she will never do. She runs the model one more time while the water is already in the kitchen. It will not help anyone on a roof, but it will be a record for the next time someone insists on denying that the ocean remembers its own laws. The numbers shimmer with what she has learned to call uncertainty and what feels like fear. She saves the file. She looks at a photograph on her desk of a causeway when she was a girl, when the year's highest tide was a novelty with selfies. She hears the wind outside her building and knows that in the morning a camera will look at a road ripped like happiness out of a postcard, and someone will say the phrase, we will rebuild, and she will ask, where? In Satkira, the river sits in the courtyard and looks like it is not leaving. In the atoll school, the wave pauses at the line of a chalk drawing and then eats it like a child eats sugar. In the barangay, the rope around 3 waists holds. The neighbor with the chainsaw arrives with the grin of a man who brings a sound that means yes, the surge peaks. Which is to say it stops pretending to be sculptural and becomes work. And somewhere under ceilings of corrugated tin, dog-eared palm thatch, pre-stressed concrete, someone hears the small, finally merciful sound of water finding a way back down. The retreat is slower than the attack. It has to be. Gravity is generous and exacting. In Florida, a refrigerator catches on a stoop and will not go through the door it entered without the CS help. In the surge mark on a wall, 2 inches of oil smear right above 4 feet of clean brown. A pelican sits on a porch railing as if it paid rent. A siren passes. A man on a metal roof shivers, not from cold but from the electric leaving of adrenaline. He pockets his phone because there is no point filming a gray that repeats. Leela stands in boots in a neighborhood whose ground she has measured in LiDAR, whose sump pumps she has written about in Grant prose. The water is shin deep, then ankle deep. She counts storm drains that exhale like tired swimmers. Compound flooding. She murmurs to a reporter with an earnest face. Rain can't exit when the sea says no. The reporter nods. What lands on the evening broadcast is a soundbite about courage. Courage sells better than drainage. In Satkira, the embankment breach is a mouth the size of a truck, a smile without teeth. The village that trusted it now learns the shape of the floodplain. This is knowledge older than everyone alive and somehow newly shocking every time. Kamal wades into a room he painted last month and kisses a wall not with piety but with the practicality of feeling for a crack that means the house will live. He finds one, he swears softly, he laughs once he tells his daughter to stop crying because the goat is fine, and the goat is fine because it is on the stair above all of them. Chewing at the rope like an accountant gnawing a pencil. On Majuro, the waves rest their elbows on the seawall and smoke a last cigarette. The classrooms smell like the ocean had a nap in them. Children pick starfish out of puddles and are told gently to let them go. The runway shines with a film that means planes must wait and groceries must swim. Mia meets the water truck and marks off jars for elders with a yellow crayon. The freshwater lens will take days, weeks maybe, to taste like childhood again, and in the meantime the drums will be arguments in plastic. In Beira, Teresa stands in a doorway and measures with her eyes the height of the mark on the wall where the sea decided to stop. It is higher than last month's high tide by the breadth of her hand. She will store that number in the pocket where she keeps the names of patients who will return with infections no pharmacy can keep up with when the water sits this long. The doctor on her left tells her a joke because his mother taught him that humor dries faster than anger. She laughs, because nurses are best at polite physics. Paulo rubs a groove in his palm where the rope tried to do the thing ropes do. He walks out into a street that has forgotten how to be ground. A line of people forms without instruction. Passing bottled water, bags of rice, a child with a bandage, a sheet of plywood. The barangay hall becomes a checklist: names missing, accounted for, angry, hungry, helpful. He writes the word pump 3 times and circles it. He will fight a bureaucrat for diesel and he will win, and then he will lose something else because that is the day's math. A Coast Guard cutter noses down a flooded boulevard in Florida and knocks softly on house corners with its bow. A rescuer coaxes a woman with a cat into a boat and says, "You are brave," as if naming it will make it true. On the highway inland, trucks stacked with drywall move like an army in a different war. A man in a suit on a raised stage says, "With gravity, we must be resilient," and Layla, watching from a crowd, wishes for different verbs: retreat, restore, refrain. In Sotkira, an argument blooms near a break in the embankment. Build it higher, build it wider, build it with cement, build it with the hands that put the first one there. A man with a sack of seed says quietly, "Mangroves," and the word floats like flotsam that does not look interesting until you touch it and it turns into a tool. The engineer from Kulna who arrives at dusk brings a topographic map and the humility of someone who has learned to be embarrassed by certainty. "We will put geobags," he says, "and plant behind." The old man touches a drawing with a finger gone to knots from Ropanor and says, "Plant first." On Majuro, they sponge the floors. They hang mats on lines. They put the books in the sun and hope the salt will leave politely. It will not. Salt is a tenant that pays on time and never moves out. Mir stands in the doorway of the clinic and watches a child drink from a cup slow as if water were a story to be savored. She writes a list for the council where the wall held, where it gave, which culvert was clogged by trash because no one wants to be bored by maintenance. She underlines trash twice and does not apologize for the ordinary word's power. In Beira, the sea returns to its rough outline and leaves behind its signature on lungs and floors and politics. A man in a shirt that says city engineer points at a diagram of a groin and a breakwater and a new idea to help the old idea. A woman at the back asks if the new idea will not push water somewhere else. He says that is always the way. She says then some other woman will stand where I stand and ask you the same question. He nods because it is both an accusation and an education. At a press conference in Florida, a slide shows present sea level where past sea level was and everyone nods because it is numbers and numbers are safe. Nobody says out loud what every coastal engineer knows in their bones. That design return periods are old and that the local sea is not the global sea when land sinks and barriers level roads and mangroves give way to lawns, and that moon and storm do not schedule themselves around mortgage cycles. Paulo listens while a priest says the words priests have said before. He watches a mother count children twice. He uses his key to open the school and puts people in rooms that were meant for multiplication tables. The generator coughs like a man with a secret, then runs. Child starts a cartoon on a phone. The room breathes out. He goes outside to where the water is taping its dissociation from the town, and he writes on a wall in chalk, "Water came here." He likes that the sentence is simple, that it avoids arguments about why, that it marks something in the world that will be read later with a finger. Layla drives past a canal that looks smug, as if to say, "I did my best." Did you? She thinks about levees that were built for the last war, and about neighborhoods on slabs that sit a foot higher than their neighbors, and about the way insurance speaks in riddles, and about how to model the thing that happens when rain plants new lakes behind closed tidal gates. She thinks about words she wants to use in rooms with carpet. Retreat where the shore wants to walk. Restore what roots can do. Refrain from walls that feed the next wall. She breathes, long and slow, and walks into a meeting where she will say them and know that some will hear. The embankment in Sotkira becomes a wall of people as much as a wall of sandbags, hands, pass-earth, bags, ropes, tools, jokes. A boy pushes seedlings into mud up to his shin and smiles because the plant holds his weight, and that seems like a miracle. The old man blesses each knot with a hand more gentle than priestly. The river watches and rolls its shoulders and says nothing, which for a river is merciful. Dusk comes with a tired kind of blue. The tide clocks are consulted. The moon is looked at and sighed at. The ocean in all four places breathes easier. The air smells of salt and diesel and the small beginnings of rot that the sun will either forgive or scold tomorrow. Paulo writes a list to carry forward to morning. Mia stacks plastic cups and locks a cabinet that will not keep out the next tide. Teresa leans her forehead against cool tile. Lila saves a file, labels it with a date and the unromantic words peak surge observed. Between the day and the next storm, there is a silence that feels like someone holding a hand over their mouth to stifle a sob. In that pause, in that ordinary hardness, somewhere a siren tests, a gate squeaks, a child sleeps heavy, the moon climbs, smaller by a sliver, and the next tide is still a risk but no longer an argument. Morning opens with work, the kind without cameras. In Florida, people hose salt out of vehicles that will never again trust their own wiring. They strip drywall and pale, crumbling bands like bark. They mark studs with Sharpie at the height the ocean reached, and then call an adjuster to make those numbers count. In the State House, someone puts resilience into a bill and resilience into a speech and resilience into a grant, and Leela holds the draft in her lap and circles the places where resilience means bigger walls and writes in the margin, in neat letters, there are other ways. In Sotkira, saline licks palms. Fields go from green to brown in a week and farmers carry on anyway because the seed has to go somewhere. Women haul sweet water from a standpipe farther away than last month because their hand pump coughs metal and sea. A man who sells prawn seed makes money and hates every note of it. Under the soft tannin shadow of a mangrove stand, saplings take hold of mud and make a net that will be a wall with 1,000 small doors in 2 years if left alone. The boy who planted them last night ties a rag around a stick and writes a name on it because this is a forest you can meet plant by plant. In Majuro they line up drums and wait. The brackish taste fades slowly, like grief for a person who is alive and far away. The council discusses a seawall, and the council discusses a retreat, and the council discusses a slogan that will lift money out of rooms where nobody thinks about the smell of rot. Mia proposes something simple. Pay the women who keep the maintenance schedule. Make sure the drains are cleared before the tides they have circled on a paper pinned near a kitchen. Pay them not in gratitude but in cash. The men nod. They do not know yet if the cash will come, but they write down her name. In Beira, the hospital empties, then fills with a different list of injuries. The city cleans and fixes and argues about a plan that says walls, and a plan that says dunes, and a plan that says move. Teresa watches a film crew make a short, elegant piece about courage. Her courage looks like scrubbing with a stiff brush until the brine loosens from a wall. She does not mind that no one watches that part. She minds that the same boxes of gloves have to be restocked with a loan they will never not owe. On the barangay's chalked wall, the line dries white. Paulo brings a tape and measures from the floor to the mark and writes it down next to last year's and the year before and the number from a story his aunt tells about a surge when she was a girl that reached the second stair. He goes to the meeting at the municipal hall and says the 3 things he learned to say without shaking his voice. Sirens you can hear. Shelters that will not break. A wall of green between us and the channel. He adds the quiet 4th. Do not sell the low place to the rich because they will build. And then ask us to rescue them. And we will. And then they will build again. Leela meets a room full of decision makers and shows a slide nobody wants but everyone needs. A map of the city with blues and purples bleeding inward under different sea level rise scenarios and different storm track possibilities. She does not show apocalypse, she shows choices. If we defend here, we must give here. If we refill marshes here, the surge that went to this street will go less far. If we stop building into the bayou, we can promise the next child who draws their home that the water will not move the line. She does not say retreat until she has said restore and remember. Then she says it once. It makes a sound in the room like waves far away. In Sotkira, the embankment is a checkpoint for 100 decisions. The engineer from Kulna meets the old man halfway. They lay a geotextile under the new face and plant mangrove whips into the wet earth at the base. The old man tells the engineer the names of the creeks that used to be here before roads. The engineer writes them down. Names are as much a tool as sandbags. Mia walks along the seaward road at dusk. The sea does what the sea always does. Pulse, glitter, preen, pretend. Children kick a ball they found in a pile of seaweed and rack, and their laughter makes a sound older than seawalls. She thinks of a plane that brought a man in a suit last month who promised a migration with dignity and no plan. She thinks of the Minister for Climate whose voice cracks when she says home on the radio. She thinks of her grandmother's breadfruit leaf and how, even with charts and apps, she still looks at the way water moves in a bowl to decide if the school needs extra mops. In Beira, a meeting without cameras wraps late. A coastal scientist from Maputo, a city planner with salt in her hair, a fisherman with one boot, a priest, a mason, a woman who sells bread all sit at a table and draw lines on paper and ask each other, not unkindly, how to live where the river wants to be. They do not agree, not entirely. But they leave with calls to make and ditches to clear and seedlings to ask for from a nursery that is mostly a man under a tree with plastic bags and hope. The storm in Florida has a name that will be added to a list, and the list will be read in a voice that remembers the last list, and the last insurance will pay some and not others, and the line will hurt more than the wind. The causeway will be rebuilt higher by a foot, then another foot. Leela will argue that a new bridge with fewer approaches and water will serve better than a patch, and she will be told about budgets and timelines in the election. She will keep a photograph on her desk of a marsh at sunrise that looks like it can save us, not because it is romantic, but because it is geometry. Friction, shallow water, drag, wind, fetch reduced by reeds. In Sutkira, the child who cried last night draws the breach on the cyclone shelter wall, and there is a tree in her drawing, and the tree is bigger than the wall, and everyone who sees it laughs in a way that means several things at once. In the barangay, someone finds the cacophony of crickets too loud because the silence of engines makes room for them to be heard, and he smiles without wanting to because life's poor jokes keep arriving. In Majuro, a letter goes out with stamps made of bird silhouettes asking for help buying pumps and tuition for 2 students to study hydrology in Suva, and a metal lathe for a man who insists he can fix the broken hinges of the sea. If there is a lesson in the week the ocean stood up on 3 continents and an island chain, it is old. We built into the breath of a thing that breathes. We can back up, we can bend, we can plant, we can teach. We can choose not to pave a wetland because someone has a beautiful rendering. We can choose to pay the unglamorous bill for the culvert to be cleaned before the moon invites water higher. We can choose to hear when the nurse says the hospital door leaks and fix it before the clouds go black. We can choose to let a mangrove be a machine that runs on sun and tide and time. None of it is easy. All of it is possible. Island nations and delta states and barrier islands and port cities are not metaphors. They are homes. They are the places where children conspire to find fish in classrooms and men tie goats to stairs and nurses count for bags by a window that holds if you place your hand against it and wish without superstition. They are the places where science can be a handrail and culture can be a map and policy can be a tide chart taped to a wall where a grandmother will look and nod. The ocean, after all its theater, returns to its business. It grazes the breakwaters, licks the legs of piers, makes music under boats. Every concrete thing has a line on it now that says, remember. In every place where water came in, someone draws that line in permanent marker, or in a story told at dusk as smoke from cooking fires smudges the air. If there is justice, it is in the listening that comes after the drama, in the slow exhale of a community that decides to take seriously the boring, blessed work of living with a breathing edge. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more true events that changed the world.